The dust hung in the air like a ghost, each particle a witness. At one end of the town's main street stood Silas Croft's prize stallion, a blood-bay creature of perfect lines and simmering impatience, its hide gleaming like polished cherry wood. At the other stood a plain gray horse with no name the town knew, a rider on its back whose stillness was a rebuke to the tension coiling through the crowd. The circuit judge, a man whose face was a map of hard miles and harder decisions, held his watch up to the unforgiving sun. "The county charter is in jeopardy in Willow Creek," he announced. "The telegraph is dead. I need a rider and the fastest horse in this territory. The life of that town depends on it." Croft had smiled, a thin, satisfied curving of his lips. There was no question whose horse that was. But then a boy's voice had cut through the murmuring. "Hers is faster." And every eye had turned to Alara, and to the gray horse that was nothing but a ghost from her past, a folly she had refused to abandon. Now, the whole town stood in judgment, waiting to see the final chapter of a joke 2 years in the telling. Croft's man was a hired jockey, light and cruel. Alara sat her own horse, her hands quiet on the reins. The judge's arm dropped. The race to the hanging oak and back, the race for the future of a town, had begun. 2 years earlier, the joke had been born in the mud and misery of the spring stock auction. Alara had stood alone at the back, a ghost then, too. A woman alone, with a deed to a patch of land everyone knew was worthless, a shallow basin of baked clay and bitterweed that her father had worked himself into the grave trying to save. She was there for a mule, maybe a pair of hardy chickens, something to turn her meager inheritance into a life. The auctioneer's voice was a practiced, rhythmic drone, but the real business was happening at the margins, where a man named Griggs, the kill buyer, sorted the wreckage. He moved with a butcher's economy, his gaze assessing not for life, but for the weight of meat and hide. His men drove a small collection of the doomed into a side pen, a sway-backed mare, a one-eyed ox, and a foal. It was a colt, gray as a stormy sky, with a foreleg so badly twisted it hopped on 3 feet, its head hanging low. It was so frail a strong wind might have claimed it. Silas Croft, whose ranch sprawled over the county's best water and greenest pastures, leaned on the rail nearby. "Look at that," he said, not to anyone in particular, but for everyone to hear. "Born broken. Some things just don't have a place in this world." The men around him nodded, their faces grimly practical. Griggs the kill buyer walked past the foal without a second glance. Not even worth the bullet. Alara watched the colt try to steady itself, its huge, dark eyes filled with a confusion that felt achingly familiar. She felt a pull, a foolish, impractical stirring in her chest. She walked over to Griggs. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the noise. "What for the colt?" Griggs squinted at her, then at the foal. He grunted. "You ain't wanting that. It's a waste of feed. What's the price?" she repeated. He sized her up, the worn dress, the determined set of her jaw, the loneliness that clung to her like dust. He saw a mark. $5. It was robbery. It was the price of a healthy calf. A ripple of amusement went through the men who heard. She didn't flinch. She had $7 to her name, meant for a winter's worth of flour and salt. She met his gaze. "I'll give you 2, he laughed, a short, harsh bark. "Lady, I'm doing you a favor by telling you no," but Alara just stood there, waiting. Her stillness was unnerving. It was not the pleading he was used to, nor the anger. It was something else, something solid and unyielding. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Fine. $2. His burial is your affair." She counted the coins into his palm, the metal cool and heavy with the weight of her choice. As she led the stumbling, terrified foal away, a man called out, "A woman alone can't work that land with a sound horse, let alone a cripple." The laughter that followed was not kind. It followed her all the way home, a chorus of scorn that promised she would fail. The foal's name was Ash. She gave it to him the first night, as he lay on a bed of clean straw in the corner of her small, tight barn, his breathing shallow and quick. His twisted leg was hot to the touch, swollen and angry. She sat with him for hours, her hand resting on his neck, feeling the frantic pulse beneath his skin. The arithmetic of her decision was brutal. $2 gone. Winter coming. A mouth to feed that could give nothing back. She had traded the certainty of bread for the uncertainty of a life. The world saw a cripple. Alara saw only the tremor of fear in his flank and the deep, trusting darkness of his eye when he finally looked at her. Her work began the next morning before the sun had cleared the eastern hills. She had her father's books, leather-bound volumes filled with a mix of practical farming advice and old country remedies. She found a passage on bone setting and livestock, underlined in his faded pencil. The bone knows the way, he had written in the margin. Give it warmth, give it time. So she gave it warmth. Day after day, she heated water on her small stove, soaked burlap sacks, and wrapped them around the colt's leg, holding them in place until the heat seeped into the swollen joint. She would murmur to him as she worked, not words so much as a low, steady hum, the sound of reassurance. He fought her at first, his small body tense with pain and fear. But she was patient. Her touch was always gentle, her voice always low. Slowly, he began to accept the ritual. She made a liniment from wintergreen and pig fat, a pungent, earthy smell that filled the barn and clung to her clothes. She would rub it into the leg twice a day, her strong, calloused fingers working the muscles, trying to loosen what was tight and soothe what was inflamed. The townsfolk who passed on the road would sometimes slow their wagons, peer into her yard, and shake their heads. They saw the foolish woman tending to her foolish purchase, and it confirmed everything they believed about her. She was her father's daughter, all right, stubborn, and impractical, destined to be broken by the same piece of unforgiving land. Her only neighbor was Old Man Hemlock, a man who lived a mile down the dry creek bed and was considered nearly as strange as she was. He was from a country none of them could pronounce, and he spoke of the land as if it were a living thing with moods and intentions. He appeared at her fence one afternoon, silent as a hawk's shadow. He watched her for a long time as she changed the hot compresses on Ash's leg. She braced for the pity, the quiet judgment. Instead, he said, in his thick, rolling accent, "Is good the warmth. But you must also give it the dark." He came into the yard and knelt beside her, his joints cracking like dry twigs. His hands, gnarled as ancient roots, felt the colt's leg with a surprising gentleness. "The bone wishes to be straight," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "But the muscle remembers the wrong way. You must teach it to forget." He showed her how to soak long strips of leather in hot water until they were pliable, then wrap them snugly around the leg from knee to fetlock. "As it dries, it pulls," he explained. "Not hard, just a little whisper, a reminder of the true line." He looked at her, his pale eyes clear and direct. "Some things, they just need the right kind of time. The bone knows the way. If you let it," he didn't offer pity or advice about selling the worthless land. He simply accepted the task she had set for herself, and in his acceptance, Alara felt the first crack in her wall of loneliness. The seasons turned. Summer bled into a crisp, golden autumn. Winter arrived with a hard, clean frost that silvered the dead weeds in her pasture. Alara's days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the small creature in her barn. The arithmetic of survival was a constant hum in the back of her mind. She measured out the oats and corn with a careful hand, a litany of numbers scrolling behind her eyes. So many pounds of grain, so many weeks until spring. So much hay in the loft, so many cold nights to get through. She mended her father's old coat, patched the barn roof with scavenged tin, and learned the geography of every rock and dip in her small piece of land. Her hands, once soft, grew rough as bark, the nails chipped, the palms permanently mapped with calluses. But they were good hands, capable and sure. They knew the feel of a proper splint, the temperature of a healing poultice, the exact pressure to apply to a frightened animal's neck to bring it comfort. The leather splints became part of her daily ritual with Ash. Every morning, she would unwrap the stiffened hide, massage the leg with a strong-smelling liniment, and then rewrap it with freshly soaked strips. At first, the progress was invisible. The leg was still crooked, the limp still pronounced. The men at the mercantile still made their jokes. "Seen Alara's racehorse lately?" One would ask, and the others would chuckle. Bet that thing could run in a circle faster any horse in the county. Alara heard the whispers when she went to town for supplies, felt the weight of their collective pity and scorn. She learned to meet it with stillness, her face a calm mask that betrayed nothing. Their words could not touch the quiet, patient work happening in her barn. She had a new companion in her work, a boy named Finn, the blacksmith's youngest son, a wisp of a child with eyes as solemn as a winter sky. He started appearing at the edge of her property, watching from a distance. He never spoke. One day, Alara was struggling to lift a bucket of water, her back aching from a long day of clearing stones from her garden patch. Finn slipped under the fence, took the bucket from her, and carried it to the barn. He stayed, watching her tend to ash, his presence a silent question. From then on, he came every day after his chores were done. He would help her, holding the lantern, fetching the warm water, his small hands surprisingly steady. He had a preternatural calm that soothed the colt. When Finn was there, Ash stood more quietly for his treatments, his ears soft and receptive. The boy and the horse seemed to understand each other, two quiet souls in a loud and certain world. Alara never asked him why he came. She simply made a place for him, sometimes leaving a biscuit or an apple on the fence post where he would find it. Their companionship was built not of words, but of shared work and a silent, mutual respect for the broken thing they were trying to mend. Then, one morning in late winter, it happened. She unwrapped the leather splint, and as Ash shifted his weight, he stood for a full minute perfectly square, all 4 feet planted firmly on the ground. The twisted leg was straight. A faint, silvery scar ran along the bone, but the line was true. Alara caught her breath. She looked at Finn, who was watching with wide, unblinking eyes. A slow smile spread across his face, the first she had ever seen. A fierce, protective joy surged through her. It had worked. The warmth, the dark, the time. It had all worked. She ran her hand down the colt's leg, feeling the solid, correct strength of it. She banked the moment deep inside herself. A secret victory, a glowing coal hidden under layers of ash, waiting for the right time to be fanned into flame. A year dissolved into the next. Ash shed his lanky foal's body and grew into a yearling. Then a 2-year-old, his coat the color of polished slate, his muscles moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for the broken creature he had once been. The leg was perfect. To a stranger's eye, there was no sign it had ever been anything but straight and strong. To the town, he was still the cripple, a symbol of Alara's folly. They had stopped laughing, but their judgment had settled into a kind of permanent, head-shaking pity. They saw what they had decided to see. Alara did not correct them. She kept to herself, her world defined by the fences of her small farm, her companions the quiet horse and the silent boy. She had broken a small patch of the bitterweed pasture, and, against all odds, her garden grew. The soil in the basin, it turned out, held moisture long after the surrounding land had cracked and dried. She had enough to feed herself, with a little left over to trade for things she couldn't make. It was a small life, but it was hers, built with her own 2 hands. She began to let Ash run. In the far pasture, hidden from the road by a stand of scrub oak, she would slip the bridle off and give him his head. The first time, it was like watching a spring uncoil. He exploded into motion, not with the frantic energy of a young horse, but with a deep, joyful power. He didn't just run. He devoured the ground, his hooves a low, rhythmic thunder. His speed was breathtaking. It was a raw, untamed force of nature. Alara would stand by the fence, her heart pounding in her chest, watching this secret miracle. She had known the leg was healed, but she had not known this. She had not known that in mending the bone, she had somehow unlocked the heart of a storm. Silas Croft rode by one afternoon, his own magnificent bay stallion picking its way delicately along the dusty road. He reined in at her fence line, looking over her property with a proprietary air. He saw her garden, the neatness of her barn, the solid repair of the fences. His eyes narrowed. He was a man who understood the world through the lens of acquisition, and he had long considered Alara's land a piece of worthless buffering for his own vast holdings. Now, he saw not failure, but a stubborn, inexplicable solvency. His gaze fell on Ash, who was grazing peacefully near the barn. The horse's fine lines and powerful build were undeniable. Croft's expression soured. "Still feeding that charity case, Alara?" he asked, his voice coated in a thin layer of condescending charm. "I'll grant you, he cleaned up better than I expected. But a good-looking horse is one thing, breeding is another. That one's got broken stock in him. You can't ever outrun what you're made of." Alara just looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't defend Ash. She didn't argue. She just gave a small, non-committal nod. "He earns his keep," she said, her voice calm and even. Her refusal to be baited annoyed him. He was used to people who were intimidated by his wealth and his certainty. "This is hard country for a woman alone," he pressed. "You've done well enough for a time. But sentiment doesn't fill a barn for winter." He gestured vaguely at her fields. "I could take this place off your hands. Give you a fair price. Enough to set you up in town, where you belong." "I belong here," she said simply. Croft's smile tightened. "Stubbornness is a poor inheritance, Alara. My offer won't stand forever." He spurred his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and resentment in his wake. Alara watched him go, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. He hadn't seen Acheron. No one had. But he had seen value, and she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that he would be back. The feeling of being watched, of a threat gathering just over the horizon, pushed Alara to act. She needed to know, in plain numbers, what she had. It wasn't enough to see the speed. She had to measure it. With Finn's help, she set about creating a rough track around the perimeter of the far pasture. They paced it off, a half-mile circuit, and used field stones to mark the start and finish lines. Alara had her father's old pocket watch, a heavy silver thing that still kept perfect time. One cool evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, they conducted their first trial. Alara rode Ash, warming him up, feeling the immense power coiled beneath her. Finn stood at the finish line, his small face serious with the weight of his responsibility. "Now!" he shouted, his voice thin in the vast quiet. Alara urged Ash forward, and the world dissolved into a blur of wind and thundering hooves. The horse ran not with the trained, mechanical gait of a racehorse, but with a wild, exuberant freedom. He flattened his body, his ears pinned back, his great lungs pumping. It felt like flying. When she crossed the stone marker, she pulled him up gently, his sides heaving, his coat damp with sweat. She trotted back to Finn, her own heart racing. The boy was staring at the watch in his hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked up at her, speechless, and simply showed her the face of the watch. Alara did the arithmetic. She knew the records from the county fair races. She knew the times the big ranchers like Croft boasted about for their expensive, blooded stock. And she knew that the number on the watch was not just good. It was impossible. They ran it again, and then a third time. The results were the same. The broken-down foal, the kill buyers reject, the town's long-running joke, was faster than any horse in the county. Faster, perhaps, than any horse in the entire territory. It was a secret too large and too dangerous to keep for long. As summer deepened, a change came over the land. The sky took on a hard, metallic sheen, the blue bleached out by a relentless sun. The rains, which should have come in gentle, regular waves, simply stopped. The creek bed that marked the boundary between Alara's land and Hemlock's, usually a muddy trickle at this time of year, was now a ribbon of cracked gray earth. Old Man Hemlock would stand on his porch in the evenings, staring at the sky. A dry anger, he'd mutter to Alara when she walked over. The land is holding its breath. The farmers and ranchers grew anxious. They talked of the last great drought, a decade past, a season of dust and ruin that had broken more than one family. The conversations at the mercantile shifted from gossip to worried speculation. The price of feed began to creep up. Silas Croft seemed unconcerned. His ranch was situated on the Black River, and his water rights were ironclad. He saw the coming hardship not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He began to visit his smaller, more vulnerable neighbors, making offers on their land, his voice laced with false sympathy. He came to Alara's farm again. This time, his condescension was gone, replaced by a blunt, business-like tone. "The coming dry spell will break you, Alara," he stated, not as a prediction, but as a fact. "Your well is shallow. Your pasture will be dust by August. I'll give you a final price for this place. A generous one, considering." She looked at him, her face calm. "I'm not selling." Mr. Croft, his eyes went cold. "Every person has a price. It's just a matter of finding it. You'll remember this conversation when you're hauling water by the bucket and your horse is chewing on fence posts." He turned and left without another word. Alara watched him go, the dust rising from his horse's hooves and hanging in the still, hot air. The drought was coming. Croft was coming. She felt like she was standing on a shoreline, watching two different tides rolling in, and she knew she would soon be caught between them. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the parched land from dawn till dusk. The fields turned from green to gold, then from gold to a brittle, lifeless brown. The earth cracked open in a spiderweb of fissures, and the wind, when it blew, carried nothing but dust and the smell of desolation. The drought was no longer a threat. It was a tyrant. The town's shallow wells began to fail one by one. The creek dried up completely. The Black River, the source of Silas Croft's confidence, shrank to a sluggish, muddy stream, its banks widening each day. Panic began to set in. The price of hay skyrocketed. Ranchers were forced to sell off their stock for pennies on the dollar, their life's work dissolving into the dust. The faces in town grew tight and grim. The easy laughter at the mercantile was replaced by the low, anxious murmur of desperate men. And then, the great fortune inversion began. Alara's land, the scorned basin of bitterweed and clay, revealed its secret. The very topography that made it poor for farming in wet years made it a savior in a dry one. The shallow bowl shape collected what little dew fell in the cool of the night, and deep beneath the clay, shielded from the sun, was a slow, stubborn spring. It wasn't a gush of water, but a steady, patient seep, emerging from fissure in the rock at the lowest point of her property. While the rest of the county turned to desert, a small patch of her pasture near the spring remained stubbornly, miraculously green. Her well, fed by the same deep source, never wavered. She had water, clean, cool water, enough for her garden, for herself, and for Ash. Her small world, once an island of scorn, was now an island of survival. She watched as Silas Croft's empire began to crumble at the edges. His vast herds, once a symbol of his wealth, were now a massive liability. They trampled his scorched pastures to powder, their desperate lowing a constant, mournful sound that carried on the hot wind. His prize-winning horses, bred for speed and beauty, not for hardship, began to sicken. Their sleek coats grew dull, their eyes listless. He had money, but money couldn't make it rain. He had land, but the land was dying. The mockery that had followed Alara for 2 years evaporated. In its place grew a strange, resentful silence. People whose pity she had endured now looked at her with a new expression, envy. They saw her green garden, the healthy sheen on her horse's coat, and they didn't understand it. It was an affront to the natural order of things. The successful were supposed to succeed, and the failures were supposed to fail. Alara's quiet survival was a disruption to their worldview. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. Whispers started. She was a water witch. She had made a deal with unseen forces. The fear and hardship were curdling the spirit of the town, turning neighbor against neighbor. Alara felt the shift and drew further into herself. She worked her land, cared for her horse, and shared what little extra produce she had with Old Man Hemlock, whose own well had begun to sputter. She knew this fragile peace couldn't last. The desperation was growing, and its face was the face of Silas Croft. Croft's desperation did not manifest as weakness, but as a cold, calculated aggression. His condescending charm was stripped away, revealing the raw steel of his will beneath. He could not accept that this woman, This stubborn, solitary footnote in the county was weathering the storm that was sinking him. It was an insult to his intelligence, to his station. He could not force her to sell, so he would find another way to take what he needed. His method was procedural, a weaponization of the law against someone he assumed was too ignorant to fight back. He arrived one morning not alone, but with the county assessor, a nervous, sweating man named Peters who owed Croft a great deal of money. Croft was all smooth, false warmth. "Alara, a small matter of a boundary dispute has come to my attention," he began, unrolling an old, brittle survey map on the hood of his wagon. "A bit of an ambiguity in the original deeds. It seems this little spring of yours might, in fact, fall just on my side of the line." Alara looked from the map to Croft's predatory smile. She knew her land. She knew the ancient, gnarled oak that marked her western boundary as surely as she knew her own name. The spring was a good 50 yards inside that line. "There's no mistake," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The line is the oak tree." Croft chuckled, a sound entirely without humor. "Ah, local custom. Charming, but the law requires something a bit more precise. According to this official survey from 1870, the line is a straight meridian from the northern ridge. Mr. Peters is just here to place the new markers." A simple formality. Peters wouldn't meet her eyes. He fumbled with his measuring chain, his hands shaking slightly. It was a lie, a transparent and brutal land grab. Croft was trying to steal her water, the one thing that was keeping her alive, the one thing that was proving him wrong. He was counting on her being one person alone. He was counting on her being a woman, unversed in the law, easily intimidated. He expected her to weep, to plead, to fold. Alara did none of those things. She looked at the false map, at the shamed face of the assessor, and at the smug certainty on Silas Croft's face. She felt a cold, clear anger rise within her, an anger as pure and deep as the spring itself. But she showed none of it. She simply stood her ground, a silent, unmovable obstacle. "You are mistaken," she said again. The simplicity of her denial infuriated Croft. "Mistaken?" he snapped, his composure finally cracking. "This is a legal document. I am within my rights." "The marker is the oak," she repeated. It has been for 50 years. They were at an impasse. Croft could not physically remove her, not with Peters as a witness. But he had set the wheels of the law in motion. He would file the claim. It would be her word against his map, her poverty against his influence. He left, confident of his victory. "The court will settle this," he called back, his voice thick with triumph. Alara was left standing in the dust, the threat no longer a gathering storm, but a house collapsing around her. She was one person alone. It was not a feeling. It was a fact. That evening, as she watered ash from the very spring Croft meant to steal, she felt the horse press his head against her shoulder. She leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his silent, solid presence. She had saved him from a world that saw him as worthless. Now, she had to figure out how to save herself. The news of Croft's legal maneuvers spread through the town like a fever. Most people sided with him, not out of conviction, but out of a grim pragmatism. Croft was power. Croft was the future. Alara was just a stubborn woman on a dying piece of land. It was easier to believe his lie than to stand up for her truth. The town was thirsty, and Croft had promised that once the boundary was clarified, he would share the water. He was turning their desperation into a weapon against her. The crisis came to a head with the unexpected arrival of Circuit Judge Mason. He rode into town on a lathered horse, his face grim. The telegraph lines were down, cut by a grass fire to the north, and he carried urgent news. A dispute over a mining claim in Willow Creek, the next county over, had turned violent. The county charter, the very document that gave the town its legal standing, was being held by a group of armed men who threatened to burn it if their claim wasn't recognized. A territorial marshal was on his way, but it would take him days. Judge Mason needed to get a signed deposition to the marshal's office in the capital by dawn the day after next, a document that would invalidate the claim and give the marshal the authority to act. It was a full day's hard ride in the best of conditions. In this heat, on a tired horse, it was nearly impossible. "I need a rider," the judge announced to the grim-faced crowd assembled in front of the hotel. "And I need the fastest horse in this county." The fate of that town, its very existence, rests on this message. A silence fell over the crowd. This was a matter of life and death, of law and chaos. Silas Croft stepped forward, his face a mask of civic duty. "Judge, my stallion, Firebrand, is the finest horse in this territory. He's drawn from the drought, I'll admit, but his bloodline is unmatched. He is your only choice." It seemed a settled fact. Croft's horses were legendary. He would provide the horse, and the town would be indebted to him. It was a masterful move, cementing his power at the very moment it seemed to be failing. He would be the town's savior, and Alara's fate would be sealed. But then, a voice, clear and steady, cut through the silence. "No, he isn't." Every head turned. Finn, the blacksmith's silent son, stood at the edge of the crowd. He had never spoken a full sentence to most of these men, but he spoke now, his voice ringing with a conviction that could not be ignored. He pointed a thin, steady finger at Alara, who stood near the back, having come to town for salt. "Hers is faster," Finn said. "Alara's horse is the fastest." A wave of disbelief, then outright laughter, rippled through the men. The joke, it seemed, had one last breath in it. "The cripple," one man scoffed. "Finn, the heat's got you." Croft shot the boy a look of pure venom. "The boy is mistaken, Judge. He's simple. The woman's horse is a worthless stray." But Judge Mason was not a man who dealt in reputation. He dealt in facts. He looked from Croft's magnificent but weary stallion to Alara, who stood quietly beside the boy, her hand on his shoulder. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a calm resolve. "Is this true?" the judge asked her directly. Alara looked at Finn, at the brave, terrified set of his jaw. She looked at Croft's smug face. She looked at the thirsty, frightened faces of the townspeople who had mocked her for 2 years. And she thought of the impossible number on her father's silver watch. "Yes," she said. The word fell into a pool of stunned silence. The judge's eyes narrowed. He was a practical man, and the stakes were too high for pride. "I cannot take a man's word or a boy's belief," he said. "There is only one way to settle it. A race. Here and now, to the hanging oak at the edge of town and back. The winner carries the deposition. The fate of Willow Creek will be decided by the speed of a horse." The main street was cleared. It was not a racetrack, but a dusty, rutted stretch of ground, a fitting course for a contest between reputation and reality. At one end, Croft's stallion, Firebrand, was a picture of coiled power. He wore a fine, hand-tooled leather saddle and was handled by a small, wiry jockey Croft kept on his payroll. At the other, Ash stood patiently. He wore Alara's plain, functional saddle, its leather worn smooth with use. He looked like what he was, a farm horse. Strong, solid, but unremarkable. The townspeople lined the street, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. They were here for the spectacle, to see the final, definitive humiliation of the foolish woman and her broken horse. Alara swung into the saddle. She leaned forward and murmured into Ash's ear, her hand stroking his neck. She could feel his calm, steady strength beneath her, a reservoir of power they had kept hidden for 2 years. She looked down the dusty street at Croft's stallion. She saw the fine breeding, but she also saw the toll the drought had taken. The horse's flanks were just slightly hollow, his energy brittle. Ash, by contrast, was filled with the strength of clean water and good pasture. He was an oasis in the middle of the desert. Judge Mason stood in the center of the road, his watch in his hand. "The rules are simple. To the oak, circle it, and back to this line. The first nose across wins the duty. Riders, are you ready?" Croft's jockey nodded, gathering his reins, his whip already in his hand. Alara simply tightened her legs, a silent signal that Ash understood. "Go," the judge shouted, dropping his arm. Firebrand leaped forward, his powerful haunches digging into the dirt, expertly ridden by the jockey. He took an immediate lead, his hooves kicking up a cloud of dust. The crowd roared its approval. It was over before it began, just as they'd known it would be. But Alara held Ash back for a dozen paces, letting him find his rhythm, keeping him clear of the choking dust. Then, she gave him his head. What happened next would be told and retold in that town for generations. It was not a race. It was a revelation. Ash flattened his body and unleashed the raw, untamed speed he had hidden in the far pasture. He did not run like a trained horse. He ran like the wind itself, a gray streak against the brown, parched earth. He closed the distance to Firebrand in a matter of seconds. The jockey, hearing the thunder of hooves behind him, glanced back in shock and plied his whip. Firebrand, tired and thirsty, strained with all he had. But it wasn't enough. Ash passed him as if he were standing still. The crowd's roar died in their throats, replaced by a collective gasp of astonishment. He reached the oak, circling it in a tight, fluid arc that never broke his stride, and turned for home. He came back down the street alone, a storm of motion, his hooves a blur, the only sound the wind of his passage and the rhythmic pumping of his great heart. He crossed the line a full 10 lengths ahead of the stallion. He slowed to a canter, then a trot, and stopped before the judge, his sides barely heaving, his ears pricked forward as if asking for the next task. The silence was absolute. The town had just witnessed the impossible. They had mocked the worthless, and the worthless had proven to be beyond price. Judge Mason snapped his watch shut. He looked at Ash with the eye of a man who recognizes true quality, regardless of its origins. Then he looked at Alara. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a new respect. "It appears you have a horse." He held out the sealed oilskin packet containing the deposition. "The territory will pay you $200 for this ride." It was a fortune. More money than Alara had ever seen. Enough to secure her land, her future, to insulate herself from the town and from Silas Croft forever. She looked at Croft. His face was a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. His lie had been undone, his pride shattered in front of the entire county. Then she looked at the faces in the crowd. She saw their shock, their shame, and beneath it their fear. They were a thirsty people, and their hope had just been proven a fool. In that moment, she held all the power. She could take the money and turn her back on them all, just as they had turned their backs on her. She could gouge them, demand an exorbitant price for the water from her spring, and become as ruthless as the man she had just defeated. The arithmetic of revenge was simple, but the arithmetic of survival she was learning was far more complex. Alara looked at the $200 in the judge's hand, a sum that represented safety and independence. She could take it, ride for the judge, and leave the town to its drought and its shame. She could finally have the last laugh, a victory as complete and crushing as the one Ash had just delivered. Her gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on the worried faces of women fanning their children, on the grim-faced farmers whose lands were turning to dust. She saw Finn, standing by the blacksmith shop, his face alight with fierce, proud joy. She saw Old Man Hemlock, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd, a rare smile cracking his weathered face. These were the people of her world, the mockers and the few who were kind, all bound together by the same hard land and the same merciless sky. She thought of the cool, clear water seeping from the rock in her pasture. A gift, and a gift, she realized, was not meant to be hoarded. She turned her eyes back to Judge Mason, but she spoke loudly, her voice carrying across the silent street so that all could hear. "I have a different price," she said. The judge raised an eyebrow. Croft, standing nearby, sneered. "Here it comes. She'll bleed us all dry." Alara ignored him. Her eyes were on the townsfolk. "I will make the ride," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And I will do it for free. But the price is water. The price is for Mr. Croft to publicly withdraw his false survey claim to my spring. Here and now, in front of you all as witnesses." A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to Silas Croft. He was trapped. To refuse would be to admit his claim was a lie, and to deny the town the ride it desperately needed. To agree would be a public humiliation. The judge looked at him, his expression cold and impatient. "Well, Mr. Croft?" "The law is waiting," cornered and furious. Croft spat on the ground. "Fine," he bit out, the word clipped and venomous. "The claim is withdrawn. That's the first part of the price," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength. The second part is for the town. When I return, I will share the water from my spring. But I am one person alone, and I cannot dig a channel to the creek bed by myself. The price of the water is that you will all help me dig it. Together, the silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of shock, but of dawning wonder, of shame giving way to a profound and humbling gratitude. She was not asking for revenge. She was asking for community. She was offering them life, and asking only for their labor in return. The mayor was the first to speak. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we accept your price, and we are in your debt." Elara gave a single, sharp nod. She took the oilskin packet from the judge, secured in her saddlebag, and without a backward glance, she turned Ash and set off at a steady canter down the road toward Willow Creek, the dust rising behind her like a closing curtain. When she returned 2 days later, exhausted but successful, she found a miracle waiting for her. The men of the town were on her land. They were there with shovels and picks, their backs bent to the task, digging a neat, straight channel from her spring to the dry creek bed. Silas Croft was nowhere to be seen, having retreated to his ranch in shame. But everyone else was there. They worked with a quiet, determined purpose, the sound of their tools a kind of penance and a promise. When they saw her ride in, they stopped, and for a moment they just looked at her, the woman they had scorned. Then the mayor took off his hat, and one by one, every man in the field followed suit. It was a silent, profound apology. The water began to flow, a thin, life-giving trickle at first, then a steady stream, making its way down the new channel, a silver artery bringing life back to a dying land. Old Man Hemlock came and stood beside her, watching the scene. Finn was already at Ash's side, stroking his neck and whispering to him. Hemlock put a gnarled hand on Alara's shoulder. His pale eyes shone. "You see," he said, his voice soft. "Some things, they just need the right kind of time. The bone knew the way. And so did you." Alara looked at the water flowing toward the town, at the horse who was no longer a cripple but a hero, at the boy who had found his voice, and at the community that was slowly, painfully, learning to be neighbors again. She was no longer a woman alone. She was the woman who had brought the water, the one who had chosen generosity over greed, who had understood that true wealth was not something you hoarded, but something you shared. The land, they said, was worthless. The horse, they said, was broken. They were wrong. They had only ever looked at the surface, and the most valuable things she now knew were the ones you had to dig for.